The Ossuary Bloom, Chapter 2, Echo Lost. The pre-dawn cycle was a fragile thing in the architect enclaves. It was not a true dawn, but a simulation, a slow, algorithmic brightening of the lumen panels from a deep indigo to a soft, sterile gray. Outside the reinforced plasteel window of her quarters, the Viridia spire was a skeleton of Gothic arches against the perpetual twilight of Aethelgard, its stained-glass eyes dark and sleeping. Within, there was only the near-silent hum of superior-grade life support and the faint, clean scent of ozone from the air recyclers. Stillness upon you. The greeting was a lie. There was no stillness in Vespera Lyrian, not anymore. She sat before the obsidian slab of her personal data terminal, the only light in the room the cool blue glow reflecting in her impassive gray eyes. Her posture was perfect, a lifetime of architect discipline holding her spine straight, her hands resting calmly on the cool metallic surface of her desk. It was the same posture she'd held in the Harmonization chamber, watching the echo-lost xenobiologist and the scavenger from the rust gardens, moments before everything had fractured. Her fingers moved with precise, economical gestures, navigating the holographic interface that floated above the terminal. The process was methodical, and digital immolation. She was erasing herself. File directory, professional commendations, a list scrolled by, accolades for efficiency, for unwavering adherence to the principles of the Great Stillness, for her work in refining the very harmonization protocols that resonance had so grotesquely violated. She selected all, a single, elegant swipe of her hand to the left. A query appeared in shimmering script. Confirm permanent deletion? Her finger tapped the affirmative without hesitation. The files dissolved into nothing, not even digital dust. File directory, project logs, decades of service, reports on ossuary maintenance cycles, analysis of low-level system glitches, the official sanitized term for the nascent whispers of resonance. Each one was a brick in the wall of the lie she had served. These were more dangerous. They were evidence of her complicity. Another swipe, another confirmation, more of her life atomized into the void. She worked with the cold efficiency of a mortician preparing a body, stripping the identity away layer by layer. Correspondence, technical schematics, security clearance authorizations. Each deletion was a snip of a thread, severing her from the vast, silent web of the architects of silence. She was becoming a ghost in their system, a phantom they could not track because, officially, she no longer existed in this capacity. Then she arrived at the final directory, archive, personal. Her hand faltered for the first time, hovering a millimeter above the cool light of the interface. This was different. These were not records of service. They were the curated fragments of a life, sanctioned memories approved for retention. A collection of sensory data files meant to reinforce tranquility, to remind one of the placid beauty of order. The scent of a synthesized silver lotus flower, the sound of a perfectly harmonized choral arrangement, the sight of a geometric light sculpture shifting in slow, predictable patterns. All hollow, all meaningless now. She deleted them, one by one, feeling nothing. Only one file remained, archive.mem.livia.734. The file name was stark, clinical, but the thumbnail was not. It was a still image, a rare, candid capture from over a century ago, passed down and preserved. a woman with Vespera's jawline and a smile that was a chaotic, beautiful mess. Her great-aunt, Livia. The memory file was an audio recording. Livia, a historian before the great stillness became dogma, laughing. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a full, uninhibited, throat-clearing laugh, a sound so rich with unapproved emotion it was practically contraband. For Vespera, it had always been a secret anchor, a reminder that before the sterile perfection of the architect's ideology, there had been this warmth, this disorderly, vibrant life. But she could not hear the laugh anymore. When she looked at the file, her mind superimposed another sound over it. The memory was corrupted, overwritten by the horror in the harmonization chamber. She saw it again. The frantic energy of the technicians, the surge of raw data, a crimson tide overwhelming the placid blue of the harmonization field. Eris Thorne, strapped to the chair, his eyes wide with a terrifying, familiar recognition. And the voice that had spoken through the station's voxcaster, hijacking the system. It had used Livia's exact timbre, the precise cadence and accent from this very recording. A perfect, horrifying mimicry. But the words were alien. The voice had spoken a fragment of the architect's hidden history, a secret about the first resonance suppressions. It wore Livia's voice like a mask, turning Vespera's most cherished private memory into a public weapon against her own order. The violation was absolute. It wasn't just that the dead were stirring, it was that they were being used. Their memories, their very voices had become puppets for something else. The sanctity of the past, the one thing the architects claimed to protect through stillness, was a desecrated tomb. Her breath caught, a tiny, almost imperceptible hitch. The memory of Livia was no longer a comfort. It was a vulnerability, a back door into her soul that had been kicked wide open. To keep it was to keep a poison vial on her shelf, pretending it was medicine. To keep it was to admit she still had something that could be taken, something that could be twisted and used against her again. Her alliance with Thorne and the scavenger was a razor's edge. It required a new kind of discipline, a discipline of emptiness. Vesper felt a tremor pass through her, a deep internal cold that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The somber weight in her chest did not disappear. It crystallized. The grief, the violation, the confusion, it all compressed into a single, hard point of diamond-sharp resolve. She had cut away the last piece of her old self that could feel pain. What was left was an instrument. She closed the terminal. The room plunged back into the simulated gray gloom. Her reflection stared back from the dark polished surface. The face was the same. The eyes were not. They were flat, devoid of history, and utterly, terrifyingly clear. She had turned her back on her dead. Now she would go hunt the thing that wore their faces. The air in the den was a thick cocktail of rust, damp earth, and the sharp, sterile scent of ozone leaking from a dozen jury-rigged power conduits. It clung to the back of Eris's throat. Bioluminescent fungi pulsed with a sickly green light in the corroded seams of the walls, casting long, dancing shadows that made the piles of scavenged tech look like sleeping metallic beasts. "You're echo-lost, both of you," Hrodar Brecker snarled, his voice a gravelly rasp that scraped against the constant low hum of the hideout. He paced the length of the cramped space, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back, a caged animal in his own den. Chasing ghosts into the arms of the men who make them. Aris flinched at the slur. Echo lost. A broken mind, a fragmented memory. It was what they called the mad on Aethelgard, and it was a fear that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. It's not a ghost, Hroldar. It's a signal, a pattern. Lyra. Her name felt fragile on his tongue, a glass figurine in a room of scrap metal. The voice we heard, the one that came through the harmonizer, it used her memory, but it spoke of Vespera's history. Don't you see? It's a connection, a bridge. I see a disgraced scientist and a traitorous architect about to get us all permanently silenced, Hroldar shot back, jabbing a grease-stained finger first at Aris, then at the woman sitting perfectly still on a crate of defunct servomotors. I see a suicide mission built on wishful thinking. Oh, a bridge straight to a neural wipe and a nice quiet spot in the ossuary. No thank you. Vespera Lyrian hadn't moved. Her black architect fatigues were scuffed with the grime of the rust gardens, but she retained an unerving stillness, her posture ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on the flickering diagnostic screen of a salvaged datapad. To Aris, she was a terrifying paradox. An hour ago, she had been the calm, collected face of his impending erasure. Now she was a fugitive, her fate lashed to his and this cynical scavenger's. "This isn't about wishful thinking," Aris insisted, his voice rising with an urgency that felt like a physical pressure in his chest. "This is about the most important discovery in human history. Consciousness, persisting after death. We have to understand it. We have to know what the architects are hiding." For a moment, the image of Lyra's face from the resonance waves superimposed itself over Vespera's. The same dark hair, the same intelligent eyes. But where Lyra's gaze had been warm, Vespera's was like polished ice. The hallucination was a razor blade against his resolve. Was he just chasing a ghost? Hroldar stopped pacing and ran a hand over his tired, weathered face. The green light carved deep canyons into his features. "Truth? There's only one truth down here, Doctor. Survival. The radiation in these gardens, it seeps into everything. The water, the food, the air. It took my daughter. Slowly. The architect's great stillness didn't save her. Their order didn't matter. Your truth won't bring her back." For a moment. "He was going to use those implants you promised me to buy passage on a void-borne freighter, to get out, to breathe real air. Now," he gestured around the den, at the 3 of them, trapped. "Now I'm stuck here with you 2, the station's most wanted." The raw pain in his voice cut through Aris's obsession. This wasn't an abstract problem for Hroldar. It was a visceral, bleeding wound. Guilt churned in Aris's gut. He had dragged this man from his bitter but stable existence into the heart of a conspiracy. Before Aris could form a response, Vespera finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but cut through the tension like a vibro-scalpel.
"Sentiment is irrelevant," she said, her eyes not leaving the datapad. "Hroldar is right. Your belief is irrelevant, Aris. My reasons for betraying my order are also irrelevant." She looked up, her gaze sweeping over them both, cold, analytical. "The facts are these. We have been identified. Our previous identities are void. We cannot go back to our lives. The architects will not stop hunting us. Stillness upon us is now a death sentence, not a greeting." She set the datapad down with a soft click. "Arguing about the philosophical implications of resonance is a luxury we no longer have. Survival," she looked at Hroldar, is now contingent on action. And action, she turned to Eris, requires a plan, not just a reason. Eris stared at her. The clinical precision of her words was both chilling and grounding. She had stripped the situation down to its brutal mechanics. Hroldar grunted, crossing his arms. A flicker of something that wasn't quite respect, but was no longer outright dismissal, entered his eyes. "Fine. What's your brilliant plan, Architect? Walk back up to the spire and ask nicely for them to stop?" "No," Vespera said, a faint, almost imperceptible line of tension in her jaw. "We go deeper. The data chip you found, Hroldar, the decoy and the real one, they're just fragments, echoes of a larger file. The source of resonance, the full uncorrupted data, isn't something they can scrub from the network. It's too foundational. It's housed in a physically isolated server, an archive from the station's founding, the first ossuary." Eris felt the jolt, a surge of adrenaline that was almost painful. An archive, authentic memory, the station's most forbidden fruit. Where? How do we get to it? "It's shielded, biometrically locked, and guarded by systems I only have partial clearance for," Vespera stated flatly. "The entire complex was designed by one man. He understood the station's oldest, deepest systems better than anyone. He built its secrets." Hroldar scoffed. "Let me guess. He's dead." "No," Vespera replied, her expression unreadable. "Worse, he was exiled, stripped of his rank and cast out for questioning the Great Stillness Doctrine decades ago. The architects fear him. They fear what he remembers. He's our first step. He designed the locks. He is the only one who might know how to break them." She stood, her slight frame seeming to command the cluttered, oppressive space. The fragile alliance hung in the air, a thing of shared desperation and terrifying possibility. Eris held his breath. Hroldar stared, his cynical mask cracking just enough to show the calculating mind beneath. This wasn't a ghost story anymore. This was a heist. Vespera looked from Eris's desperate hope to Hroldar's grim pragmatism, her own face a blank slate of resolve. He was the architect of the ossuary before they exiled him to the lower levels. "We need to find Valerius Otho." The air in Hroldar Brecker's workshop was a thick soup of conflicting stenches. Hot metal, acrid flux, and the damp, loamy rot of the rust gardens seeping through the corroded walls. For Eris, it was the smell of a cage. The same two architect security officers who had flanked Vespera at the door now stood outside, their blank-faced helmets a silent promise of oblivion should her gambit fail. She had bought them time, nothing more. A stay of execution, not a pardon. Hroldar was sullen, a caged bear in his own den. He moved around the cramped space with restless energy, organizing piles of scavenged circuit boards and coiling rust-flecked cables, his heavy boots echoing on the grated floor. He hadn't spoken a word since Vespera had coolly dismissed her guards with a promise to deliver the fugitives for Harmonization herself, a lie so audacious it had frozen the breath in Eris's lungs. Now Vespera knelt in the center of the only clear space on the floor. She worked with the chilling, detached efficiency Eris had seen in the ossuary. Her fingers, nimble and precise, manipulated a small, obsidian-black device she'd produced from her architect uniform. It looked like a folded insect, all sharp angles and dark polished carapace. She unfolded its legs, twisted a lens into place, and the air hummed. "The station's primary archive is not a library," she said, her voice cutting through the tension.
It's a fortress, a mausoleum for a single idea.
A cone of pale blue light erupted from the device, splashing against a sheet of salvaged hull plating Horildar had bolted to the wall. Dust motes danced in the beam like microscopic stars. Within the light, lines of code and intricate geometric patterns began to resolve. Eris felt a familiar academic awe rise in his chest, a ghost of the man he used to be. It was a schematic, but it was also a work of art, a three-dimensional nested nightmare of security protocols. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Vespera's tone was flat, devoid of admiration. "Every architect aspirant studies its design theory. We are taught to see it as the physical manifestation of the great stillness, perfect, silent, and impenetrable." Horildar stopped his clattering and turned, wiping grease from his hands with a filthy rag. He stared at the shimmering projection, his lip curled. "Looks like a spirograph had a seizure." "An apt description," Vespera conceded, unfazed. She pointed a slender finger into the light, her nail tracing a path through the outermost layer. "Layer 1, Biosignature Gateways. The system reads the genetic markers and neural frequency of anyone who approaches. Only a registered, high-clearance architect can even get close enough to touch the door. Any other biological reading triggers an immediate localized system purge. Not an alarm, just a quiet wave of energy that denatures all organic matter in a 5-meter radius." Eris swallowed, the recycled air suddenly feeling thin and sharp in his throat. He saw himself reaching for a data port and then dissolving into a cloud of steaming protein. "Beyond that," Vespera continued, her voice becoming a clinical monotone, "is the labyrinth, a series of cognitive traps. Your specialty, doctor, or it was. The system probes an intruder's psyche and generates a personalized mental prison. It finds your deepest guilt, your most profound loss, and builds a world from it, a loop. You'd be lost in a memory, living your worst day over and over, while your physical body starves to death, thinking it's having dinner." "Charming," Horildar grunted, crossing his thick arms. "So we'd need an architect to get in the front door, and a man with no regrets to get through the hall. We're done before we start." "There's more," Vespera said, zooming the projection deeper into the core. A sphere of impossibly dense, interwoven light pulsed at the center. The data core itself is suspended in a quantum state. Any unauthorized attempt to access it, any fluctuation in the surrounding energy fields, any method that deviates from the precise, multi-stage key sequence, and the core collapses. Every byte of data, every record of Aethelgard's founding erased in less than a nanosecond. It's designed to fail into nothingness, to protect the lie by destroying the truth. A heavy silence fell over the workshop, broken only by the drip of condensation from a ceiling pipe and the low hum of the projector. The schematic pulsed before them, a monument to their own futility. This wasn't a heist, it was a suicide note. "So that's it, then," Eris said, his voice hollow. The flicker of hope Vespera's betrayal had ignited was guttering out. "It's impossible." "From the outside, yes," Vespera replied, her gaze fixed on the glowing orb of the data core. "It is a perfect expression of control, absolute, uncompromising, and self-annihilating. But the architects made one miscalculation. They enshrined the design, but they tried to erase the designer." She looked up, meeting Eris's eyes, then Hroldar's.
For the first time, a crack appeared in her stoic facade. Not emotion, but the shadow of it, a cold, dangerous fire. Every complex system has a philosophical flaw, a single exploitable weakness born from the ego of its creator. The architect who designed the archive believed in purity, in singular vision. He built no back doors, no redundant overrides for a committee to use. He built one key, a single point of failure that only he would recognize. Hraldar leaned forward, the sarcasm draining from his posture. Who? His name was Valerius Otho, Vespera said, the name spoken with a strange reverence. He was a genius, the primary author of the Great Stillness Doctrine. He believed that memory was a disease and that emotional tranquility was the only path to survival. The archive was to be his masterpiece, the final word in a history he wanted to end.
Eris felt a tremor of recognition. A man obsessed with an idea, willing to build a monument to it. He knew that kind of man. He saw him in the mirror every morning. "What happened to him?" Eris asked, his voice barely a whisper. "He became a heretic," Vespera stated. Years after the archive was completed, when the first whispers of resonance began to appear in the ossuary, the Synod ordered it suppressed. A system glitch, a corruption. But Otho disagreed. He saw the patterns, the faint traces of intelligence. He argued that it wasn't noise to be silenced, but a language to be understood. Eris's heart hammered against his ribs. The words were his own, thoughts he'd barely dared to form, spoken aloud by a ghost from the past. He wasn't alone. He wasn't the first to see it. He tried to use the archive's sensor arrays to listen to the resonance, to communicate with it. The architects declared his actions blasphemy, a dangerous corruption of his own perfect creation. They excommunicated him, wiped his name from the official records, and sentenced him to exile. Vespera's finger traced the edge of the schematic. They threw him away, but they kept his lock. Hraldar scoffed, but there was a new edge to it, a spark of interest. Exiled where? The void? Worse, Vespera said, shutting off the projector. The room plunged back into its familiar dimness, the oppressive gloom suddenly feeling less like a cage and more like a staging ground. They exiled him here, to the lowest, unmonitored, decaying levels of this station. They made him echo-lost, a non-person. They believe he's long dead. The uncertainty that had clouded Eris's mind for days, a fog of grief and confusion, began to burn away. In its place, a single, sharp point of light, a purpose. It wasn't about Lyra, not just about her. It was about the truth, a truth another man had been damned for seeking. "You think he's still alive?" Eris stated. The words were a realization, not a question. "A man like Valerius Otho does not simply die," Vespera said. Her voice was steel. "He endures. He is the system's ghost. He knows its secrets, its flaws, its philosophy. He is not a key. He is the man who forged the lock, and we are going to find him."
The lab was a mausoleum of dead ambition. Eris's abandoned xenobiology station sat quiet in the cavernous hollows of the lower ossuary levels, a place he hadn't dared enter for years. Now it was his only sanctuary. The air was thick with the ghost scent of ozone and formaldehyde, a cloying sweetness that clung to the back of his throat. A constant, low hum vibrated through the rusted deck plating, the death rattle of Aethelgard's failing life support. Water, thick with mineral deposits, dripped with a maddening, rhythmic slowness from a corroded conduit onto a pile of discarded data slates. Drip. Drip. He stood before a massive, dark observation window that once looked out onto a menagerie of cryopreserved alien flora. Now it was just a black mirror reflecting a haunted, haggard man. His reflection, flanked by the skeletal frames of dormant sequencing machines, was overlaid by the ethereal glow of bioluminescent fungi that crept along the window seals, pulsing a soft, sickly blue. A single holographic emitter on his workbench flickered, projecting a static-laced image of a molecule that had once consumed his entire world. It was a monument to his failure, to the obsession that had cost him everything, cost him Lyra. His fingers traced the cold, grimy surface of the workbench, coming to rest on a small, powered-down datapad. Her face wasn't on it, but it was the one she'd always used to send him notes. Reminders to eat, a snippet of poetry she'd found, a simple, "I love you." He squeezed his eyes shut, the memory of physical ache in his chest. The heist felt insane. Trusting Vespera, an architect, felt like embracing a predator. Trusting Herwaldar, a man who would sell his own soul for a ticket off this decaying rock, was just as mad. And Valerius Otho, an exiled architect, a ghost from a previous regime. How could they possibly... The dripping stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than the familiar hum it replaced. Arisa's eyes snapped open. The air grew cold, sharp, stripping the warmth from his skin. The blue fungi coating the window frame began to pulse faster, their light intensifying, washing the lab in a strobing, otherworldly glow. The metallic tang of recycled water was suddenly replaced by something else. A scent he hadn't smelled in 5 years. White jasmine. Her perfume.
Echo lost, Harwadar had called him, a man chasing ghosts. A dry, humorless sound escaped his lips. He wasn't chasing, he was being haunted. In the center of the room, the air began to shimmer, like heat rising from scorched metal. The dust motes, illuminated by the pulsing fungi, swirled and coalesced, weaving themselves into a shape, a form. It started as a translucent outline, a mirage of a woman standing in the heart of his failure. Slowly, impossibly, she solidified. Her form drank the dim light, gaining substance, color, texture. The worn fabric of her technician's jumpsuit, the way a stray lock of dark hair fell across her forehead, the small specific scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall. Lyra. She looked exactly as he remembered her from that final morning on Xylos. Not the broken thing he'd pulled from the wreckage. No, this was Lyra in her prime, alive, perfect, a memory so polished by grief it had become a holy relic. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic prisoner demanding release. Part of his mind, the scientist, screamed that this was a neurological cascade, a hallucination brought on by stress and proximity to resonance. But the rest of him, the broken husband, didn't care. He would trade his sanity for this one moment. She took a step toward him, her movements fluid, silent. She didn't belong here amidst the decay and the rust and the failure. She was a flower blooming in an ossuary. Her eyes, the warm, deep brown that had been his only anchor, found his. There was no accusation in them, only a profound, sorrowful love. "Aris," she said. Her voice wasn't an echo. It wasn't a recording. It was here, in the room with him, a low, intimate sound that vibrated in the very marrow of his bones. my love." He couldn't speak. He could only stare, tears blurring her perfect form. She was so close now. He could feel a phantom warmth radiating from her, chasing away the sudden chill. She raised a hand, her fingers long and delicate. He flinched as she reached for his face, but he didn't pull away. He couldn't. Her touch was cool, impossibly real. Her thumb stroked his cheek, wiping away a tear he hadn't realized had fallen. The sensation was an electric jolt, a current of pure, agonizing hope that short-circuited all logic. "Don't be afraid," she murmured, her gaze unwavering. "I'm still here. I've always been here, waiting for you." "Lyra," he finally choked out, the name a shard of glass in his throat. I don't understand." "You don't have to," she whispered, her eyes full of gentle encouragement. "You just have to listen." She leaned closer, her scent enveloping him. "That woman, the architect, Vespera, she's frightened, but she's right, Aris." The word sent a tremor of shock through him. He had expected condemnation. He had expected a ghost's rage, a reminder of his unforgivable sin. Not this, not validation for this insane path. "Valerius Otho, he's the one, Aris. He helped build this place. He knows the first secrets, the real secrets, before the silence, before the lies." Aris stared at him, his mind reeling. How could she know these names? How could this memory have access to his present? As if sensing his doubt, her expression softened further, becoming impossibly tender. Her fingers tightened ever so slightly on his jaw, holding his gaze, demanding his focus. "He is the key, Aris. He is the key to bringing me back." There it was, the one thing he wanted more than redemption, more than truth, more than life itself. Reunion. "Properly," she added, the word landing with the force of a physical blow. "Not like this, not as a ghost in the machine. Together, like we were supposed to be." Her image began to flicker, the edges of her form dissolving back into shimmering light. Panic seized him. "No, wait, don't go." She gave him one last lingering smile, full of promise and agonizing love. "Be brave, my Aris. Bring me home." And then she was gone. The scent of jasmine vanished. The air became stale and heavy again. The hum of the station returned, louder now, more oppressive. The dripping resumed its maddening rhythm. The lab was just a tomb once more. But everything had changed. The melancholy that had settled in his bones like rust was gone, burned away by a clean, white-hot fire. He stumbled back from the observation window, his hand pressed to the cheek she had touched, the phantom coolness still tingling on his skin. He was not echo-lost. He was not insane. He was a man with a mission. The heist was no longer a desperate gamble for a sliver of truth. It was a righteous quest, a holy war against the architects of silence who had kept her trapped, fragmented, a whisper in the static. Vespera's caution, Heroldar's cynicism, the astronomical risks, they were all just obstacles, acceptable losses. His eyes scanned the lab, no longer seeing a graveyard of his past, but an arsenal for his future. He strode to his primary console, his movements now sharp and decisive. He slammed his palm against the activation panel. The screen, cracked and dark for 5 years, sputtered to life with a shower of green and gold sparks. A system schematic of the ossuary levels flickered into view. Deep beneath the public levels, a single sector was marked in blinking red. Archive 0 Alpha, the architect's heart. "Bring me home," she had said. He would. The noodle bar was a wound in the flank of the lower habitation ring, perpetually weeping steam. Haroldur sat hunched over a chipped ceramic bowl, the lukewarm, slick noodles inside smelling faintly of formaldehyde and synthetic pork. He didn't eat. His gaze drifted through the swirling vapor, across faces blurred by condensation and dim, flickering light. The air was a thick cocktail of dampness, recycled water's metallic tang, and the cloying sweetness of the broth that was the primary sustenance for this strata of Aethelgard. Above the constant low hum of failing life support, he could hear the rhythmic clatter of chopsticks on ceramic and the wet sound of a dozen people slurping their dinner. His hand rested on the canvas satchel by his hip, the dense, reassuring weight of the power cell within a cold anchor in the oppressive warmth. He was tracing the path of a bioluminescent fungus creeping up a conduit near his table, when a shadow fell over him. The figure slid onto the bench opposite without a sound, their movements fluid, practiced. Haroldur didn't look up immediately. In this world, direct eye contact was an invitation. Looking away was a challenge. He waited. "Stillness upon you," the voice rasped, little more than a dry whisper. It was a voice scrubbed of identity, a gravelly, androgynous tone that could belong to anyone and no one. "And on the void," Haroldur grunted, finally lifting his eyes. The person, Jax they called themselves, was a study in anonymity. A gray synth-cloth jacket with the collar up, a dark cap pulled low. The steam and shadows did the rest, leaving only a sharp chin and a pair of dark, restless eyes that darted around the room, cataloging exits, threats, and potential marks. They never settled on Haroldur for more than a second at a time. Jax flagged down a server drone with a curt two-fingered gesture. It whirred to their side of the table, and they pointed at Haroldur's bowl. "One of those. Extra brine." The drone chirped in affirmative and zipped away. Silence settled between them, thick and heavy as the steam. Haroldur knew the dance. You don't rush a predator while it's sniffing the air. "Heard you were poking around the cleanup sites," Jack said, their eyes fixed on a flickering neon sign across the walkway, its faded gold characters advertising a neural harmonizer. "Dust from the ossuary sticks to you." "I'm a scavenger," Haroldur replied, his voice flat. "I go where the junk is. The architects are messy. They leave things behind." "They leave ghosts behind," Jax corrected, their own bowl arriving with a soft clink. They picked up the offered chopsticks but didn't eat, just stirred the pale noodles in the murky broth. "Most people are smart enough to leave them be. Chasing echoes, it's a good way to become one." Haroldur leaned forward, his elbows sticking to the grimy surface of the table. "I'm not chasing an echo. I'm looking for a librarian, one who misplaced a book a long time ago." "An architect, name of Valerius Otho." Jack stopped stirring. The tiny, almost imperceptible motion was like a klaxon in the oppressive ambiance of the bar. Their eyes finally, properly, met Haroldur's. There was no warmth in them, only calculation. "An architect," Jax repeated, the words a low hiss. A dreg from the rust gardens is looking for a disgraced architect. That's a story I haven't heard before. Sounds expensive? Sounds dangerous. Everything is dangerous, Hroldar countered. Breathing this air is dangerous. But I'm not asking for a favor, I'm a customer. Jax gave a dry, humorless chuckle that was barely a sound. A customer. Your kind trades in scrap metal and ration cards. The kind of information you want. The price is much higher. You can't afford it. This was the moment, the pivot. Hroldar reached into his satchel. He didn't pull the cell out, not yet. He just let his hand rest on it, making sure the gesture was visible. I salvaged something special. A whisper from a better time, something that holds its charge. Jax's eyes flickered down to the satchel, a spark of genuine interest finally cutting through the professional paranoia. Untraceable power was more valuable than echoes, more useful than favors. It was freedom. It was life. A lot of whispers turn out to be lies. This one is real. Hroldar slowly, deliberately pulled the power cell from the bag and placed it on the table between them. It wasn't large, it was dense, its casing a matte, non-reflective black alloy he didn't recognize. A single amber light pulsed from its core, slow and steady as a healthy heart. A pre-decay soul-corp fusion cell, the kind they used on colony ships, a relic of impossible value. The low chatter of the noodle bar seemed to fade away. The only reality was the grimy tabletop and the soft amber glow. Jax stared at it, their professional mask cracking for a fraction of a second to reveal raw, naked greed. They reached out a hand, then stopped, pulling it back. "Show me," they commanded, their voice tight. Jax pulled a small handheld scanner from their jacket pocket. Hroldar nudged the cell forward. The device emitted a low hum as a pale blue light washed over the cell. A string of data scrolled across the scanner's small screen. Hroldar could see the numbers ticking up. Core integrity, 98.7%. Estimated cycle life, 5 decades. Jax's breath hitched. "It's clean," Jax whispered, more to themselves than to Hroldar. They deactivated the scanner and slid it away. Then, with a fluid motion that belied their shabby appearance, they snatched the power cell and secreted it deep within their jacket. The deal was made. Jax leaned in, the feigned disinterest gone, replaced by a conspiratorial intensity. The smell of stale synth stem and recycled air washed over Hroldar. "You're a fool, scavenger. Otho isn't just disgraced, he's erased. He delved into things the architects wanted buried, the real history, not the stillness and silence they preach." "Where is he?" Hroldar pressed, his own voice a low growl. "Disgraced. He's erased. He delved into things the architects wanted buried, the real history, not the stillness and silence they preach." "Where is he?" Hroldar pressed, his own voice a low growl. "He's not on any official level. He's gone deep, deeper than the ossuary. There's a place, a dead zone in the old transit network, beneath the colony archives, an unsanctioned data haven. The brokers and data ghosts, we call it the Codex Sepulchre." The name hung in the air, cold and sharp. Codex Sepulchre, a library and a tomb. It's a place for things that can't be deleted, memories too corrupted for harmonization, banned histories, the station's original sins. Otho is its keeper now. He curates the rot. Jacks began to slide out of the booth, their form already starting to dissolve back into the steam and shadows. "One more thing, scavenger," Jack said, pausing. "For the quality of the merchandise, a free piece of advice." Hraldar waited. "The reason the architects don't just glass the place is because they can't. The data there is entangled. Otho isn't just hiding in an archive. He lives inside it. And the echoes in a place like that, they're not just memories. Be careful what ghosts you go looking for." And then they were gone, melted into the crowd of hunched shoulders and empty bowls. Hraldar was alone again, the space opposite him now disturbingly empty. The amber glow was gone, replaced by the dull film of the tabletop. He had the name, he had the location. It was a success, but it didn't feel like one. It felt like he'd just traded one heavy burden for another, a physical weight for a metaphysical one. He thought of the promised payment from the doctor, of the shuttle ticket, of a sky that wasn't made of rusting metal. That was the real prize, the only one that mattered. He pushed the cold, greasy bowl of noodles away from him, the motion final. The price was paid. Now he had to descend into a tomb to collect. The air in Hraldar Brekker's hideout was a thick stew of smells. Wet rust, the sharp tang of ozone from a sputtering power conduit, and the cloying sweetness of decaying hydroponic slurry from the levels below. It was an atmosphere of slow collapse, a perfect microcosm of Aethelgard itself. Aris felt it coat his tongue, a gritty film of someone else's decay. He stood hunched over a makeshift table crafted from a salvaged servitor chassis, its metallic surface scarred and pitted. In his hand he cradled the authentic data chip Hraldar had finally surrendered. It felt impossibly small, a smooth, dark lozenge that held the potential to either save him or damn him completely. His thumb traced its edges, a nervous habit he couldn't quell. Across the cramped space, Hraldar moved with a predator's economy, shoving ration packs, a multi-tool, and coils of microfilament wire into a worn canvas satchel. Every clank of metal and rustle of fabric was a sharp, percussive sound in the oppressive humidity. "Don't drop that, Doctor," Hraldar grunted, not looking up. His voice was like grinding stones. "Took me a month of crawling through architect filth to find it. Be a shame if it slipped down a grate." "I won't," Aris murmured, his own voice sounding thin and academic against the grime. He was a creature of sterile labs and hushed archives. This place, this entire situation, felt like a waking infection. Vespera was a portrait of stillness in the corner, a stark contrast to the surrounding chaos. She had laid out a small kit of her own on a cleaner patch of metal. Not survival gear, but tools of her former trade, a neural frequency modulator, a data scrambler, and a palm-sized power cell. She cleaned them with a quiet, unnerving precision, her movements deliberate and efficient. She was preparing for a different kind of war, a war of information and ideology. For a moment, a fragile sense of purpose settled over the workshop. The pact was sealed, the objective clear. They had the chip. The next step was to find a secure terminal, deep within the station's forgotten service corridors, to access whatever secrets it held. They had a plan. They had a chance. Then came the sound. But Vespera froze. Her hands, which had been methodically polishing the casing of the scrambler, went perfectly still. Her head cocked, her entire body suddenly rigid, a statue carved from ice. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, stared at the corroded wall in front of her. "What is it?" Aris asked, his voice barely a whisper. Raldar finally looked up, his permanent scowl deepening. "More ghosts?" Ignoring them both, Vespera slowly, carefully reached inside her tunic. She pulled out a small, flat disk of obsidian-black material, no larger than the data chip Aris held. It was seamless, featureless, a piece of architect technology that looked utterly alien amidst the scavenged junk of Raldar's world. She laid it on the clean patch of metal. The chirp sounded again, louder this time, emanating directly from the disk. "What is that thing?" Raldar demanded, taking a half-step closer, his hand resting on the hilt of a wicked-looking vibro knife sheathed at his hip. "A back channel," Vespera said, her voice tight, controlled. "A ghost link. It passively monitors encrypted architect tactical chatter. It's not supposed to be active. It's not supposed to make a sound, unless—" She trailed off, her knuckles white as she pressed her fingertips to the disk's surface. A lattice of faint golden light bloomed across the black surface, forming complex geometric patterns that shifted and writhed. It was the language of the enemy, and only she could read it. Aris watched, his breath caught in his chest. The fragile hope of a moment ago was evaporating like mist. "What else?" he pressed, the words sticking in his throat. "Unless they're sending us a gift basket," Raldar sneered, his eyes darting towards the workshop's reinforced door. "Stillness and tranquility for the echo lost." Vespera didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the shifting light, her lips moving silently as she translated the coded bursts of data. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken dread. The rhythmic drip of water became a maddening countdown. Aris could feel his own pulse thundering in his ears, a frantic counterpoint to the station's dying hum. "My former unit," she finally said, her voice a low, chilling monotone. "The 5th Cleansing Cadre. My unit." The name hung in the air, clinical and monstrous. A cleansing cadre. Not a security team, not an enforcement squad. A term reserved for sanitation, for the removal of filth. "They've been dispatched," she continued, the words coming faster now. Her professional detachment was cracking, revealing the raw fear beneath. "Triangulated. They got a ping from the harmonization equipment when you were apprehended." She looked at Aris, then Raldar. "A residual energy signature. My signature." "Where?" Raldar's voice had lost his sarcastic edge. It was now sharp, pragmatic. "Where are they?" Vespera's gaze flickered across the golden lattice. "Routing protocols, predictive algorithms. They're running patterns based on my psychological profile." A look of profound violation crossed her face. They were using her own mind, her own training, against her. "They're not searching the upper spires. They're not sweeping the ossuary. They know I'd go down, to the noise, to the chaos." She looked up from the device, her eyes finding Aris's. They were dark pools of terror and certainty. "They're here," she said, the words barely audible. "Rust Gardens, Sector GAMMA 9. That's us. That's here." Aris felt a cold dread wash through him so intense it made him dizzy. The walls of the workshop seemed to shrink, the piles of scavenged metal pressing in on him. This wasn't a distant threat anymore. This wasn't a conspiracy to be unraveled. It was footsteps in the corridor. It was the sound of the bolt cutter at the door. "How long?" Haraldar snapped, slinging his satchel over his shoulder. He was already in motion, his body a blur of purpose. "The dispatch order is stamped for on-site harmonization," Vespera said, the clinical term sounding more obscene than any curse. "Not arrest, not detainment, erasure." Here in this grimy hole they would be strapped down and have their minds wiped clean, their memories scoured away until nothing was left but a placid, drooling shell. A fate worse than death. She finally looked away from the dying light of the disk, her face a pale mask. "They don't move slow, they don't knock, they move in silence, and they are thorough. They will seal the sector block by block, based on their entry point and standard sweep protocol. We have less than 5 minutes before they are at that door." The air punched out of Eris's lungs. 5 minutes. 5 minutes to escape a team of elite hunters who knew their target's every thought, every instinct. It was impossible. Roldar didn't waste a second on panic. He lunged toward a large ventilation grate in the floor, its metal fins thick with corrosion and slick with algae. With a grunt, he kicked at the locking mechanism. It groaned, but held. "Doctor, that chip! Put it away!" he barked. "Vespera, the light! Kill the light!" Eris fumbled with the data chip, nearly dropping it as Roldar's shout snapped him out of his frozen terror. Vespera swept her hand over the black disk, and the golden lattice vanished, plunging her corner back into shadow. Roldar kicked the grate again, harder. Metal shrieked in protest. "They'll have thermal, bioscanners. They'll find us," Eris stammered, his mind racing through scientific impossibilities. "The recyclers below vent waste heat that can blind a thermal scanner, if you know the right tunnels," Roldar shot back, putting his shoulder into the grate. "And the fungal blooms screw with biosignatures. This is my world, Doctor, not theirs." The grate gave way with a deafening kerrang! And clattered into the darkness below. A blast of hot, putrid air rushed up, smelling of rot and ancient water. "We have 90 seconds to be 2 levels down and moving." He glanced back at them, his face a grim mask in the gloom, his eyes glinting. "Through the vent! Now! Move!" The world had compressed to the burn in Eris's lungs and the rhythmic slap of his worn boots on grated metal. Air, thick with the scent of rust and ozone, sawed at his throat. He was a creature of sterile labs and hushed archives, but now his body was a failing machine, pushed past every tolerance. Ahead of him, in the gloom, was Vespera. She moved with a fluid economy he wouldn't have thought possible, her dark technician's uniform melting into the shadows between flickering emergency lights. Behind him, he heard the heavier, angrier tread of Roldar, punctuated by a string of muttered curses that were half wheeze, half prayer. "This way!" Vespera's voice was a sharp hiss, barely audible over the station's eternal low hum. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew they were following. To stop was to be caught, and to be caught was to be undone. Eris stumbled, his hand shooting out to brace against a wall slick with condensation and patches of eerie blue-green fungi. The texture was disturbingly soft, like bruised flesh. He pushed off, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The irony was a bitter acid in his gut. An hour ago, this woman, Vespera Lyrian, had stood over him with the detached calm of an executioner, ready to subject him and the scavenger to neural harmonization, to scour their minds and leave them placid, empty shells. Now she was their only hope. Her betrayal of the architects was their shield. "Try to keep up, Doctor," Haraldar rasped, shouldering past him. The big man's face was pale in the strobing light, his breath coming in ragged bursts, but his eyes held a grim, feral focus. "They don't offer tea and biscuits at these reunions." They plunged into a narrower artery of the station's maintenance network. Here the grand Gothic decay was gone, replaced by purely functional squalor. Bundles of thick, dust-caked cables, like fossilized entrails, lined the walls. Water dripped from corroded pipes, each drop echoing in the confined space with the finality of a closing lock. The cloying sweetness of decay was stronger here, mingling with the metallic tang of recycled water. It was the smell of a body slowly failing. Then Eris heard it. Not the drip, not the hum. A new sound, carried on the recycled air. It was faint at first, then clearer, a rhythmic, disciplined beat. Footsteps. Not frantic like their own, but measured, confident. The sound of hunters who know their territory. The sound of absolute, unhurried purpose. His blood went cold. He risked a glance over his shoulder down the long, dark corridor they had just fled. He saw nothing but receding darkness, but the sound was undeniable. 2 sets of feet, maybe 3, moving in perfect, unnerving synchronicity. "They're coming," Eris breathed, his voice tight with panic. "I have ears echo lost," Haraldar grunted, not slowing, "and they've got better shoes than we do." Vespera cut sharply to the left, ducking under a massive, leaking coolant pipe that hissed softly. She motioned them against the wall, her hand a pale command in the dark. "Quiet!"
They were at a junction. A nexus of decaying service tunnels radiated from a small circular hub. In the center of the floor was a heavy iron grate, and from below rose the sound of a colossal fan and the faint, unsettling scent of formaldehyde. They were somewhere above the upper processing layers of the ossuary. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The steady, metronomic cadence of architect security. They didn't run. They didn't need to. They were an algorithm of pursuit, methodical and inevitable. The great stillness in motion. Aris held his breath, the frantic beat of his own pulse roaring in his ears. He felt a tremor of something deeper than fear. It was the terror of being erased, not killed, but unwritten. He saw Lyra's face in his mind, her smile, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, and then the horrifying image of that memory being wiped away, smoothed over into a blank, tranquil void. That was what the footsteps promised. "They'll use standard suite protocol P7, Vespera murmured, her eyes fixed on the corridor they'd come from. Her face was a mask of concentration. "Central Command, flanking routes, thermal scan at intersections. They'll check this junction last." "Glad to know we're at the bottom of the list," Hrodal whispered back, his sarcasm a thin shield against the encroaching dread. "It gives us time," she countered, her gaze darting around the hub. She pointed a finger at a tarnished bronze panel on the wall, its surface covered in grime. "Aris, that's a manual environmental control node. The access key is a simple twist lock. Can you open it, quietly?" Aris stared at the panel, then at her. His hands were trembling. He was a xenobiologist. He mapped the dead neural pathways of extinct aliens. He wasn't a technician. "What if I break it? What if it makes a noise? What if it's rusted shut? What if—" "Now, Doctor!" Vespera's voice cut through his panic, sharp as broken glass. He nodded, a jerky puppet-like motion, and moved to the panel. Hrodal stood guard, his big frame tense, his gaze locked on the darkness of the corridor. The footsteps were so close now. Aris could hear the faint scuff of their boots, the whisper of their gear. He fumbled with the lock, his fingers slick with sweat and grime. It wouldn't turn. It was frozen with decades of corrosion. "Come on," he pleaded with the inanimate object. He wrapped both hands around the T-shaped handle, ignoring the sharp edges digging into his palms, and put his whole body into it. The metal groaned in protest, a sound that seemed to scream through the tunnel. Aris froze, his eyes wide with terror. The footsteps stopped. Silence. A heavy, profound silence that was somehow more terrifying than the pursuit. They had heard. They were listening. They knew. Then, with a final agonizing shriek of metal, the lock gave way. The panel door swung open with a soft click. Aris nearly collapsed with relief, his breath shuddering out of him. Vespera was on it in an instant. Her fingers danced across a series of grimy switches and dials inside, a language she knew by heart. Her expression was unreadable. She was no longer a fugitive. She was an architect, wielding the station's own systems as a weapon against her creators. She flipped a final, large red switch. A low rumble vibrated through the floor, and from one of the adjacent tunnels, a powerful gust of wind blew out, carrying with it a cloud of dust and the scent of stagnant water. It was a pressure equalization vent. "A false trail," she whispered, pulling the panel shut. "The sound will have carried down tunnel 4 Gamma. Standard procedure is to follow the acoustic anomaly before doubling back. It will buy us minutes." As if on cue, the footsteps resumed. But they were different now. They were moving away from them, their rhythmic march fading down the corridor she had indicated. Aris leaned his forehead against the cold, damp wall, his body shaking with the adrenaline crash. Hroldar let out a long, slow breath, a cloud of vapor in the chill air. "Well, I'll be damned. You're actually useful." Vespera ignored him, her attention already moving forward. She pointed down a dark, vertical shaft laddered with corroded rungs. "This way. It leads to the underscaffolding of the rust gardens. They won't follow us there. The radiation logs are falsified. It's far more dangerous than the official reports claim." She swung herself onto the ladder without another word, and began to descend into the absolute blackness. Hroldar glanced at Aris, a flicker of something, not respect, but perhaps a grudging acknowledgement in his tired eyes. "Your new friend's a real charmer. Still, better than being harmonized. Come on, Doctor. The tour's not over yet."
Aris took one last look back into the empty corridor, the silence where the footsteps had been. They were safe. For now. He gripped the cold, wet rung of the ladder, the relief doing little to warm the ice that had formed in his soul. They had escaped the hunters, but they were now willingly descending into a new kind of decay. The portal was not a door. It was a wound in the station's skin, a jagged rectangle put into a bulkhead behind a bank of deactivated atmospheric recyclers in a forgotten maintenance corridor. Hroldar pried it open with a low grunt, the corroded metal groaning in protest. Beyond it, there was only darkness and a strange electric smell. "Stillness upon you," Aris muttered, the prayer a hollow reflex. He ducked under Hrodar's arm and stepped through the opening. The world changed. The constant, oppressive hum of Aethelgard's failing life support was gone. In its place was a different kind of sound, a chorus of 1,000 whirring fans, the electric thrum of overloaded power converters, and the high-frequency whine of data processors working themselves to death. The air was dry and hot, thick with the scent of ozone and dust, so old it felt like inhaling history itself. It was the smell of a tomb, not for bodies, but for information. Before them lay a cavern, not one of natural rock, but of technology. Towers of scavenged server racks and mismatched shelving units soared into an upper darkness where the station's vaulted Gothic ceiling was lost to shadow. They were canyons of forbidden knowledge, their walls lined not with stone, but with countless data slates, black, gray, and faded government-issue crimson. Thick bundles of cables, like gnarled black vines, snaked across the floor and climbed the racks, pulsing with faint, multicolored light from thousands of status LEDs. This was the Codex Sepulchre, an unsanctioned library, a black market archive where Aethelgard's suppressed memories came to fester. Eris felt a wave of vertigo, a sensation that was equal parts terror and reverence. He was a xenobiologist, a man who had built his life on the acquisition of knowledge. To see this hoard of raw, unfiltered truth, compiled in defiance of the architect's great stillness, it was like a devout man stumbling upon a lost holy text. Cautious awe bloomed in his chest, a fragile flower in the wasteland of his recent fear. "Keep moving," Heroldar grunted, giving him a rough nudge. "And keep your eyes down. Staring is a good way to get a corrupted data spike in your neck." Aris tore his gaze away from a shelf of what looked like pre-colony theoretical physics slates, texts he'd only ever read about in censored summaries. He followed Heroldar along a narrow walkway of grated metal that rang softly with each footstep. Down in the canyons between the data stacks, he could see them, the inhabitants, the librarians of this necropolis. They were pale figures, stark and gaunt in the intermittent glow of flickering monitors. Some sat cross-legged on the floor, tangled in wires, their eyes wide and unblinking as they communed with their terminals. One, a woman with matted white hair, looked up as they passed. Her face was a skull, illuminated from below by a cracked data slate in her lap. Her eyes weren't hostile. They were hollowed-out pits of pure, undiluted paranoia. She watched them pass without a word, then her gaze snapped back to her glowing slate, her long fingers stroking its surface as if it were a priceless relic. "Echo lost," Vespera breathed, her voice tight with a mixture of revulsion and something else. Pity, perhaps. Every one of them. "They're not lost," Heroldar countered, not turning around. "They're free. Traded their ration cards and their sanity for a truth the architects didn't want them to have. Some truths are worth more than food, eh, Doctor?" Aris didn't answer. He was listening to the hum. It wasn't just machinery. Beneath the whir of fans and the crackle of electricity, there was something else, a faint polyphonic murmur, like a crowd whispering in a cathedral. It rose and fell in rhythmic waves, a digital tide washing through the servers. He wondered if it was just the aggregate noise of thousands of processing cores, or if it was the data itself, whispering its secrets into the heated air. The voice was a sliver of ice in his spine. It wasn't in the air, it was in his head, a phantom signal riding the edge of the server's hum. Lyra's voice, so faint, so impossibly clean amidst the digital cacophony. He stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs. His hand instinctively went to the side of his neck, where the neural implant port was a small circular scar. "What is it?" Vespera's voice was sharp, pulling him back. She had stopped beside him, her eyes scanning the shadowy recesses of the stacks around them. Heroldar turned, his face etched with irritation. "Don't stop, never stop." "I heard something," Aris said, his own voice a strained whisper. "You're in a library of ghosts, Doctor," Hroldar scoffed. "Of course you heard something. That's the point. It's all just noise. Keep it that way." Aris forced himself to move, his legs feeling like lead. Was it a hallucination, a product of his damaged implant and fraying mind? Or was resonance here too? Could it leak through the station's networks, finding a home in this vast repository of memory? The line between the remembered dead and the recorded past was blurring into non-existence. This place wasn't just a collection of facts, it was a digital ossuary, a counterpart to the flesh and blood one where this had all begun. They moved deeper, the air growing warmer. Bioluminescent fungi, a pale and eerie blue, grew in patches where condensation dripped from overhead pipes onto hot server casings, casting the scene in a spectral glow. The architecture of the stacks grew more chaotic, the shelves leaning at precarious angles, held up by rusted support struts and hope. They passed an alcove where a man sat hunched over a jury-rigged console. His fingers flew across a keyboard with frantic speed, his face illuminated by scrolling lines of green code. As they drew near, he froze, his entire body going rigid. He slowly turned his head, his eyes magnified by thick lenses, locking on to Vespera. "Architect," he hissed, a sound like tearing synth-cloth. He scrambled backwards, crab-like deeper into his warren of wires and monitors. "No stillness here, no harmony, only the signal, only the truth."
Vespera flinched as if struck. She said nothing, but Eris saw her knuckles whiten on the grip of her weapon. To these people, she was the monster in the dark, the avatar of the system that wanted to erase them. For the first time, Eris saw not an architect, but a soldier behind enemy lines. Hroldar finally stopped, holding up a hand. They were in a small clearing of sorts, a space where the stacks gave way to a semicircular wall of the station's curving hall. In the center of the clearing was a structure, a makeshift den built from scavenged server casings, sheets of polished metal, and mismatched transparent screens that flickered with cascading data streams. A single bare cable ran from a junction box overhead, snaking down into the heart of the hovel, powering it. It looked less like a home and more like a tumor on the archive's nervous system. "We're here," Hroldar said, his voice low. He gestured with his chin toward the chaotic structure. The entrance was a flap of blackened, fire-retardant fabric. "He's in there." "Who?" Eris asked, his throat dry. Hroldar gave a grim, humorless smile. "The man you're looking for. The heretic who started this whole mess. Valerius Otho. The architect who remembered too much." Eris stared at the crude dwelling. From within, he could hear the faint, rhythmic clicking of a keyboard and the low, constant murmur of a man talking to himself. The awe he'd felt was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged dread. This was no abstract temple of knowledge. It was a madman's cell, and they were about to step inside. The Codex Sepulchre wasn't a place on any official station schematic. Vespera had led them through a network of maintenance shafts and decommissioned service corridors, places where the scent of ozone from sparking conduits was so thick it made Eris's teeth ache. The air grew cooler here, drier. The pervasive, cloying sweetness of the ossuary levels faded, replaced by the crisp, sterile smell of ancient plastic and dormant electronics. Dust motes, thick as insects, danced in the beams of their handlights.
The sepulchre was a cavernous 3-story vault, a forgotten library from a time before neural direct data. Towering racks of physical data slates, obsidian black and inert, rose into the oppressive gloom. Faded gold leaf, chipped and peeling, still clung to the edges of the Gothic arches that supported the ceiling. It was a tomb for information, a monument to obsolescence. And somewhere inside, its self-appointed keeper was waiting. "His nook is in the central server aisle," Vespera murmured, her voice barely a disturbance in the profound silence. "He's jury-rigged his life support to their power grid, the one thing the architects never fully decommissioned." Hroldar grunted, his heavy boots making no sound on the grated floor. "Parasite with standards. I can respect that." Aris felt a knot of hopeful anxiety tighten in his stomach. Valerius Otho, a name spoken with equal parts reverence and contempt in the fragments of architect history he'd managed to piece together. One of the original minds behind neural harmonization, exiled for ideological impurities decades ago. If anyone understood the architect systems well enough to break them, it was him. He was their key, their ghost in the machine. They found the nook wedged between two colossal server monoliths from the station's founding era, a nest of cables, some thick as a man's arm and others like fibrous nerves, snaked from a compromised junction box into a cramped space, shielded by a curtain of scavenged, rust-pocked metal. A single bare bulb cast a sickly yellow glow within, illuminating a chaotic diorama of decay and function. And there he was. Valerius Otho was less a man and more a component. He was ancient, his skin as thin and translucent as old parchment, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. He sat in a heavily modified dental chair, its plush red fabric worn through to the foam. A dozen fine fiber-optic filaments emerged from a tarnished silver plate bolted to his temple, feeding into a humming console that looked far older than the station itself. His eyes, pale and watery, flicked toward them as they approached. They were the only part of him that seemed to have any life left. They were sharp, intelligent, and utterly devoid of welcome. Aris stepped forward, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "Valerius Otho, my name is Aris Thorn. We need your help." Otho's lips peeled back from yellowed teeth in something that wasn't a smile. A dry, rasping sound, like sandpaper on bone, escaped his throat. "Help." The word was a shard of glass. "The dead are walking, the butchers are sharpening their knives, and you come to me for help?" His gaze drifted past Aris, settling on Vespera. I recognize the stink of the order on you, even if you've shed the robes. A little stray, are we?" Vespera stiffened. "My name is Vespera Lyrian. I've left the architects. I believe they've corrupted the very principles they were founded upon." "Principles?" Otho puffed, a wet, rattling sound. "The only principle they ever had was a scalpel and a steady hand. The great stillness is just a pretty name for a lobotomy. You learned nothing." Aris pushed on, his hope beginning to fray. "We know what they're doing. We know they're suppressing resonance, but we believe there's more to it. There's a foundational data archive, the station's uncorrupted birth records. If we can get to it, stop!" The single word cut through the air, sharp and absolute. Otho's eyes pinned Aris in place. "Just stop. You are children. You are children who have found a fallen power conduit and are debating the best way to lick it. Do you have any idea what you're asking? You want to commit sacrilege, not against some phantom ideology, but against the very physics of their control." He gestured with one trembling skeletal hand at the machinery around him. "This is what it takes to stay free. Not freedom of thought, you naive fool. The freedom to simply be, to have one single private memory they cannot touch. I have spent 30 years building this cage to protect myself from my own creations, and you want me to help you knock on the front door of the abattoir? But you created harmonization, Aris pleaded, taking another step forward. Roldar put a hand on his shoulder, a silent warning. You must know its weaknesses, its back doors.
I created a tool for neurological therapy, Otho rasped, his voice gaining a venomous energy. They weaponized it. They are not misguided. They are not afraid. They are butchers. They don't just erase memories, Thorn. They unmake the person who had them. They reach into your soul and edit you, paragraph by paragraph, until the story of who you were is just blank, screaming static. And you think you can fight that with, what, hope? A turncoat acolyte and a garden scrounger? His gaze flicked to Roldar. No offense. Roldar shrugged, his expression unreadable in the gloom. None taken. He's not wrong. We have data, Vespera said, her voice tight with strained composure. A chip from a suppression site. It proves they are hiding something about the resonance. Otho let out another dry, rattling laugh. A chip. A single, beautiful, suicidal little piece of data. They probably let you have it. They will follow its scent right to my door. They will trace the ripples of your little rebellion, and when they find the source, they will not be gentle. They will bring their tools, and they will make me quiet, permanently. He leaned forward, the filaments tethering him to the console, pulling taut. His pale eyes burned with a cold, ancient fire. I chose exile over oblivion. I will not trade it for martyrdom on the altar of your foolish crusade. I will not have my mind scraped clean to the bone because you saw a ghost of your dead wife and thought it was a call to destiny. The words hit Aris like a physical blow. He staggered back, the air knocked from his lungs. How could he know about Lyra? The resonance. Had Otho felt it too? It's not a ghost, Aris whispered, the words tasting like ash. Isn't it? Otho sank back into his chair, the energy draining from him. He looked impossibly old again, defeated. I've seen a dozen like you over the years. Echo-lost fanatics chasing a whisper in the static. Every single one of them ended up as a name on a sanitized accident report, their memories recycled into the nutrient paste. He closed his eyes. The conversation was over. Leave, he said, his voice a tired final command. Leave your hope and your delusions and get out of my tomb. The stench of it is drawing flies. The single bulb in his nook flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the space into absolute darkness. Only the faint green and amber status lights of his humming console remained, like the eyes of some deep-sea predator. They stood in the oppressive silence for a long moment. The hope that had carried Aras through the rusted guts of the station had evaporated, leaving a cold, heavy dread in its place. He had been so sure, so certain that the creator of the system would be the key to its undoing. Instead, they had found only a mirror of their own futility. Herr Delar clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that was surprisingly gentle. Well, the scavenger said into the gloom, that went about as expected. Vespera said nothing. Aras could just make out her silhouette, rigid and unmoving. She was staring at the black void where Valerius Otho had just rejected not only their mission, but her entire life's betrayal.
the stark rejection was a verdict. They were alone, and they were fools. The air in Otho's nook was a physical presence, thick with the scent of hot dust, ozone, and the cloying sweetness of decay seeping up from the lower levels. It coated the back of Eros's throat. Valerius Otho, a man folded into the shadows of his self-imposed exile, remained hunched over a terminal that looked more like an anatomical specimen than a piece of technology, its casing flayed open to reveal a tangle of glowing wires and jury-rigged heat sinks. "It's not a feedback loop," Eros insisted, his voice strained with a desperation he despised. He leaned his palms on the one clear corner of Otho's workbench, a space littered with data slates and empty nutrient paste packets. "Feedback is random. This is patterned, structured. It's carrying information." Otho didn't look up. The only acknowledgement was the subtle quickening of his fingers across the holographic keyboard, lines of emerald code scrolling faster up the curved, flickering screen. Information. Yes, the dying screams of a corrupted data buffer, the last gasp of a failing capacitor. Very informative, Doctor. Perhaps you can write a paper on the existential angst of our station's hardware. His bitterness was a blade, honed by years alone in this forgotten alcove of the Codex Sepulchre. A vast tomb-like archive where Aethelgard's pre-collapse data went to die. Gothic arches, grand enough to house giants, were lost in the oppressive gloom above them, their stained-glass windows black and sightless. Otho's nook was a cancer of rogue tech growing in the corpse of a library. "My wife. I saw my wife," Aris said, the words catching in his throat. He hated how weak he sounded, how much like one of the echo-lost souls babbling in the spire's lower corridors. "Her name was Lyra. The event replicated her appearance, her essence." "The brain is a pattern recognition engine, Thorn," Otho shot back, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "It sees faces in water stains and hears voices in static. Your grief is projecting onto a system failure. It's tragic and it's mundane. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm in the middle of decrypting black box telemetry from a transport drone that flew a little too close to the Architect's private comms relay, a far more interesting ghost than the ones you're chasing." Frustration burned in Aris's chest. He had come here because Hroldar's data chip, the real one, contained more than just the audio fragment of the resonance event. It contained fragmented architect protocols, routing logs that pointed like a trembling finger to this forgotten corner and the name Valerius Otho, the exiled architect, the master of the old systems. "The data led me to you, Otho. Your name was buried in the suppression protocols. They weren't just erasing a glitch, they were targeting a signature that you might recognize." That finally made Otho's fingers pause. He didn't turn, but Aris saw the man's shoulders tense beneath his threadbare tunic. "Ancient history. I designed the foundational architecture for the Ossuary's neural archives, a fact the current regime would prefer everyone forget, especially me." "Then you know the system is capable of more," Aris pressed, sensing the first crack in the wall. "You know it can do more than just store and decay. This isn't just memory, it's an echo, a resonance, and it's learning." Otho let out a short, harsh laugh. It was a sound like grinding rust. "Learning. Doctor, you're personifying a malfunction. It's what you xenobiologists do. You see a twitch, and you call it a thought. You see a signal, and you call it a soul. There is nothing there." He turned then, his face a pallid map of cynicism in the green glow of the monitor. His eyes were dark, sunken, but they held a frightening intelligence. "Let me tell you what is there. There are protocols I designed to prevent catastrophic data decay. Fail-safes. When a neural pattern degrades, the system attempts to patch it with adjacent data. Sometimes it pulls from the archive of another consciousness. The result is a momentary, meaningless composite, a flicker, a ghost made of bad code. It is a bug, Dr. Thorne. A bug I spend 10 years of my life trying to squash. Now please, leave." Aris felt his hope withering. He had staked everything on this. Otho was his only way into the deeper systems, the only one who might know what the architects were truly afraid of. As Aris opened his mouth for one last desperate plea, the air changed. It began with the sound, the constant low-level hum of Aethelgard's life support, the gentle drip of condensation from a pipe somewhere in the darkness above. It all seemed to fall away into a sudden, profound silence. Then a new sound rose to take its place, a low bass thrum that Aris felt in the bones of his jaw. The lights in Otho's nook, already erratic, began to pulse in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. A wave of cold, unnatural air washed over them, carrying that sharp, metallic scent of ozone, but stronger this time, cleaner, like the air after a lightning strike. "What is this?" Otho murmured, his eyes flicking around the alcove, his old dismissal replaced by a flicker of professional alarm. Aris's blood ran cold. He knew this feeling, the premonition, the oppressive weight in the atmosphere just before a manifestation. "It's happening," Aris whispered, "right now." Near Otho's terminal, the air began to shimmer. It was like watching heat rise off hot metal, a distortion in reality itself. The dust motes dancing in the monitor's light swirled and coalesced, forming a vague, wavering column of static. It was less a figure and more the suggestion of one, a glitch in the fabric of the room. It was indistinct, less defined than the echo of Lyra he had seen before. This was weaker, faint. Otho stared, his mouth slightly agape. His cynicism was gone, replaced by the pure, unvarnished shock of a man seeing the impossible. Then came the voice. It wasn't a voice in the air, but a sound that seemed to leak directly from the speakers of Otho's terminal, a crackle of static, a wisp of digital noise that struggled to form a word. It was the sound of a voice filtered through 100 years of decay and distance. Ilara. The name was a ghost of a sound, barely intelligible. Aris almost missed it, but Otho heard it. He heard it perfectly. The architect's fingers, which had been frozen over his keyboard, clenched into white-knuckled fists. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. His eyes were wide, fixed on the shimmering distortion. They weren't just frightened. They were filled with a profound, soul-deep horror, a look of agonizing recognition. "No," Otho breathed, a sound so quiet Aris barely caught it. "It can't be." As quickly as it had begun, the phenomenon collapsed. The low thrum ceased, the light steadied, the shimmering static dispersed back into motes of dust. The normal, miserable sounds of Aethelgard rushed back in to fill the silence. The nook was exactly as it had been seconds before, but everything had changed. The silence that remained was heavier, charged with the impossible. Aris's heart hammered against his ribs. He watched Otho, who hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. The man was a statue of shock, his bitter facade shattered into a million pieces. "Otho," Aris said softly, Did you hear that?" Otho slowly, mechanically turned his head from the empty space where the figure had been. He looked at Aris, but his eyes seemed to be looking through him, seeing something far away, buried in time. The architect who had dismissed ghosts with such acidic certainty now looked like he had just seen one rise from his own grave. His voice was a dry, cracking whisper, devoid of all its earlier arrogance. The signature, the structure you mentioned." He swallowed hard, his throat clicking. Show me everything you have."
The air in the Codex Sepulchre, thick with the dust of forgotten data wafers and the low hum of ancient servers, was shattered by a sound that did not belong. It began as a high-frequency whine, a dentist's drill boring into the very fabric of the station. Eris flinched, his hand frozen over the primary console of the archive. Haraldar was already moving, his back flat against a rack of humming machinery, the crude lines of a scavenged pulse pistol emerging in his grip. Valerius Otho, the exiled architect, simply closed his eyes, a man hearing a familiar death knell. From Vespera's perspective, the sound was a violation. It was the precise surgical signature of an architect breaching tool, a sound she had authorized a dozen times, but never been on the receiving end of. The whine crescendoed, and with a deafening crack of supercompressed air and thermal shock, the heavy, vault-like door to the codex buckled inward. It didn't explode, it was simply undone. Shards of sheared plasteel rained onto the grated floor, and a clean, sterile white light sliced through the sepulchre's gloom, smelling of ozone and absolute authority. 4 figures stood silhouetted in the doorway. Their forms were immaculate, clad in the sterile white fatigues of an architect suppression unit, a stark contrast to the rust and decay of the ossuary. They held pulse rifles, not aggressively, but with the casual readiness of those who have never known true opposition. They moved as one, fanning out with silent, practiced efficiency, their helmeted faces devoid of humanity. They were specters of order in a tomb of chaos. Leading them was a woman without a helmet. Her silver hair was pulled into a severe, tight bun, and her face, unlined by age but etched with a chilling placidity, was a mask of serene conviction. Senior Architect Ilara, Vespera's mentor, the woman who had taught her the catechism of the great stillness, who had praised her for her dispassionate control. Seeing her felt like a physical blow. Vespera's stomach plummeted, a cold knot of dread tightening in her gut. A conditioned reflex screamed at her to lower her weapon, to stand at attention, to await instruction. Her own pulse pistol felt alien in her suddenly trembling hand.
Ilara's gaze swept the room, dismissing Haroldar's snarling posture and Eris's academic terror as one might dismiss grime on a window. She gave a flicker of recognition to the pale, defeated face of Valerius Otho. Then her eyes, the color of a winter sky, settled on Vespera. They held no anger, no hatred, only a profound, clinical disappointment. "Vespera Lyrian," she said. Her voice was exactly as Vespera remembered, calm, quiet, and carrying the weight of an unshakable creed. It cut through the low throw of the servers and the panicked thumping of Vespera's own heart. "Stillness upon you."
The greeting, once a comfort, was now a threat. "Ilara," Vespera breathed, her voice a dry rasp. "This is a sad diversion from a promising path," Ilara continued, taking a slow, deliberate step into the room. The guards mirrored her, their rifles tracking the group with unnerving precision. "But it is not an irreversible one. The sickness of curiosity, the corruption of rogue sentiment, it can be excised." "You call this a sickness?" Eris burst out, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and indignation. He gestured wildly toward the central archive console. "The truth is in there, the truth of what you've done, what you're hiding." Ilara's eyes did not waver from Vespera. Eris was a symptom, not the disease. "The echo lost will always chase phantoms, Vespera. You were trained to know the difference between data and noise, between memory and its cancerous echo. You have fallen into the noise." "There are no echoes here," Otho said, his voice weary but firm. "Only the station's foundational sin, Ilara, and you are its high priestess." Ilara offered a faint, pitying smile. "Valerius, still clinging to heresy after all these years, your sentimentality was always your fatal flaw." She returned her full, undivided attention to her former student. "I am offering you a mercy, Vespera. Surrender. Submit to reharmonization. We can grant you stewness again. We can wipe this unfortunate chapter clean. You can be pure again." The word mercy hung in the air, thick and cloying like the scent of formaldehyde from the ossuary's upper levels. It was the architect's ultimate weapon, the promise of peace through oblivion, the offer to kill the person you were and replace it with a placid, obedient shell. Vespera's mind fractured. One part of her, the disciplined technician, saw the tactical reality. 4 pulse rifles against 1 pistol and a scavenged piece of junk. 2 scientists and a broken old man. The calculation was simple, the outcome absolute. Surrender was the only logical path. But then she looked at Eris, at the raw, desperate hope warring with terror on his face. She thought of the echo that had spoken with her grandmother's voice, a violation that had cracked the foundation of her world. She felt the cold, hard reality of the data console behind her, a truth she had betrayed everything to reach. She had already killed her old self. To surrender now wasn't a return. It was a desecration of her own sacrifice. "You call wiping a mind a mercy?" Vespera's voice was stronger now, fueled by a nascent, unfamiliar rage. "That's not purification. It's murder." From the side, Hroldar let out a low, guttural sound. Murder's their trade. They just dress it up in pretty words." His pistol remained steady, aimed at the nearest guard. Ilara's expression did not change, but a new coldness entered her eyes. The mask of disappointed mentorship was slipping, revealing the unyielding enforcer beneath. "A life mired in emotional chaos and false memory is not a life. It is a contagion. We are the cure." She took another step, her immaculate boot crunching on a shard of the broken door. The guards' rifles hummed, a subtle shift in their power cells, indicating they were a hair's breadth from firing. "You are a plague," Vespera shot back, her own pistol rising to aim squarely at Ilara's chest. For the first time, a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed Ilara's face. "So be it," she said, her voice dropping to an almost inaudible whisper that carried more menace than any shout. "The offer of mercy is rescinded. You have chosen to remain part of the corruption." She raised her hand, fingers slightly curled, a signal to her unit. "Subdue them. The exile and the scavenger are expendable. The scientist is to be contained for analysis. Vespera is to be prepared for public harmonization." The finality of the sentence was a physical force. Public harmonization, not a quiet erasure, but a broadcast execution of the mind. A lesson, a warning. The world narrowed to the space between Vespera and Ilara. The low hum of the servers, the dripping of distant condensation, the scent of decay and ozone. In that moment, Vespera wasn't a technician or a traitor. She was simply a cornered animal, staring down the calm, certain face of her own annihilation. The choice had been made for her. Now all that was left was the screaming. The air in the Codex Sepulchre was a tomb's breath, cold, still, and heavy with the metallic tang of ozone from the server monoliths that rose like black granite headstones into the gloom. Flickering gold emergency strips along the floor cast their faces in a sickly, jaundiced light. Eris stood behind her, his breath coming in ragged bursts, a man running on the fumes of desperation. Haraldar was a coiled spring of violence to her left, his hand wrapped around a heavy-looking salvage tool, his knuckles white. Before them, blocking the only archway out, stood senior archivist Theron. He wasn't flanked by security officers with pulse rifles. That wasn't his way. His weapons were stillness and certainty. Theron, her mentor, the man who had guided her first steps into the sanctum of the architects, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of profound disappointment. "Vespera," he said, his voice the calm, measured tone that had once soothed her, that had explained the sacred calculus of the great stillness. Now it was a blade sliding between her ribs. "Look at what you are doing. Look who you are with. An echo-lost pariah and a rust garden scavenger. You are disrupting the harmony. For what? A ghost in the machine?" His gaze was heavy, a physical weight. It demanded she remember her oaths, her training, the years spent mastering the delicate art of neural harmonization. She had believed in it. She had believed in him. The order, the control, the serene quietude they offered a station screaming in its slow-motion collapse. It was a noble purpose. It was peace. But the memory of that resonance wave hijacking her own console, the voice of her long-dead grandmother speaking through the echo of Aris's wife, that wasn't peace. That was a violation. That was a lie buried under 150 years of other lies. Farron's harmony was the silence of a gagged prisoner. She risked a glance at Aris. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terrifying, feverish hope. He wasn't a pariah. He was a man drowning, and in his desperation he had found the one piece of wreckage sharp enough to cut her free from her own sinking vessel. "He is not a ghost, Theron." Vespera's voice was tight, a strained chord in her throat. "It's something else, something you've been hiding." Theron let out a soft, pitying sigh. "We hide things to protect, the way a parent hides a blade from a child. The population is not ready for the complexities you are meddling with. You were not ready. You have allowed your empathy, your sentiment to corrupt your function." He took a single, slow step forward. The polished obsidian floor reflected his distorted image. "Come back, Vespera. We will perform the harmonization. We will correct this imbalance. You can be still again." Still. The word was a curse. It was the sterile quiet of the ossuary pods, the final dreamless sleep they enforced. It was the placid emptiness in the eyes of citizens after a session, their rough edges sanded away, their inconvenient griefs and passions erased. She had been an artist of that emptiness. The thought now filled her with a profound, corrosive self-loathing. The desperation that had been a cold knot in her stomach began to burn, melting into something harder, something decisive. She met his gaze. His eyes, the color of faded gold, held no malice, only a vast, unshakable conviction. He would not stop. He would simply erase this entire event, erase this defiance from her mind, and she would thank him for the peace he gave her. She would go back to being a functionary in a mausoleum, a jailer of memory. The line was here. It was now. To step back was to be annihilated. To step forward was to become a monster in the eyes of the only world she had ever known. Her choice was simple: annihilation or monstrosity. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the station's low, funereal hum. She saw the faint twitch at the corner of Theron's mouth, the barest hint of a victorious smile. He thought he had her. He thought her hesitation was the precursor to submission. He didn't know that she wasn't just an architect-technician. She was an archivist's protégé. She knew the station's secrets, not just its protocols. She knew its bones. She lifted her wrist, her fingers brushing the comm bead nestled behind her ear. Her eyes never left his. In them, she saw the reflection of the woman she was about to kill, the loyal, disciplined Vespera Lyrian. "Theron," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying across the cold, silent chamber. "You taught me that the first duty of an archivist is preservation, and that desperate systems require desperate measures." His brow furrowed. The smile vanished. He saw the change in her, the shift from cornered animal to apex predator. She took a steadying breath, the recycled air tasting of formaldehyde and regret. Then she spoke the words, a command string from the station's founding, a failsafe so archaic it was listed only in the most restricted codices, a contingency for a fire that could melt data cores. Override protocol septem ignis. Authorization Lyrian Vespera alpha grade. Execute command purgatio cryo. For a half-second, nothing happened. Theron's eyes widened, not in fear, but in shocked recognition. He opened his mouth to shout a single word, "Traitor!" but it was swallowed by a deafening roar. It wasn't fire, it was the opposite. With a sound like the world tearing in half, vents Vespera didn't even know were there, slammed open in the high vaulted ceiling. High-pressure coolant vapor, a substance meant to flash freeze a core breach, erupted downwards in thick, billowing clouds. It was not a gentle mist, it was a physical assault, a screaming, solid wall of white that hit the floor with the force of a tidal wave. The temperature plummeted instantly. The air became a lung-searing, frozen agony. Frost bloomed across the server monoliths in crystalline spiderwebs. The gold emergency lights became hazy, diffused smears, then were extinguished altogether as the intense cold shattered their delicate filaments. The Codex Sepulchre was plunged into absolute chaotic blackness. The only sound the unholy shriek of venting coolant. Vespera didn't hesitate. Blind, she lunged sideways, her muscle memory of the room's layout a perfect map in her mind. Her hand found Eris's arm. his sleeve already stiffening with ice. He yelped in shock and pain as the cold bit into him. "This way!" she shouted. Her voice was swallowed by the tempest, but she pulled him bodily, dragging him towards where she knew a maintenance conduit was hidden behind a false panel.
Hroldar was already there, a darker shadow in the swirling dark. He slammed his salvage tool into the wall with a percussive clang, and a section of Gothic stonework groaned open. The three of them tumbled into the narrow, dark passage, the roar of the cryo-purge slightly muffled as Hroldar heaved the door shut behind them. The blackness in the tunnel was total, the silence profound after the storm. All Vespera could hear was Eris's chattering teeth and her own ragged breathing, the icy vapor clinging to her skin like a second, dead layer of flesh. She had done it. She had used her master's greatest secrets against him, turning a tool of preservation into a weapon of chaos. There was no going back. The stillness was broken. The trap was not a sound, but a cessation of it. One moment, the Codex Sepulchre hummed with the quiet reverence of a billion silent memories stored on crystalline platters. The next, a profound, gut-wrenching silence fell as the main power conduits were severed. Then, the chaos. Emergency lights cast the cavernous archive in a bloody, pulsing crimson. A klaxon began to scream, a manic counterpoint to a new, rising hum, a low, bone-deep thrum that vibrated up from the deck plates. Resonance. A mass event, triggered and weaponized. They're flushing the system, with us in it. Vespera's training took over, a cold subroutine overriding the hot spike of panic. Her eyes scanned the vast chamber, cataloging threats. 2 security officers in the obsidian armor of the Architect's Guard were advancing from the main entrance, their shock batons crackling with blue-white energy. More would be coming. Eris was somewhere to her left, lost in the strobing darkness, his face a mask of horror as Otho's execution had played out on the archive's main view screen moments before. The old architect, Valerius Otho himself, was crumpled near the central console, his body trembling, his eyes wide and unfocused. The psychic backlash from the broadcast had shattered his composure. Before Vespera could formulate a plan, Hroldar moved. The scavenger was a creature of pure momentum. He lunged across the floor, grabbed the front of Otho's fine robes, and hauled the disoriented man to his feet. "This way! Side conduit!" he yelled, pointing with his chin towards a narrow service hatch set deep between 2 towering server racks. Otho stumbled, his legs like jelly. "The stillness! They broke the stillness!" he mumbled, his mind clearly fractured. "No time for hymns, old man," Hroldar snarled, half dragging, half carrying him towards the promise of escape. Vespera turned to follow, to cover their retreat. But a figure stepped from the shadows of a data stack, blocking her path. The form was slim, clad in the stark white and gold of a senior architect, a stark contrast to the crimson emergency lighting. The face was one Vespera knew better than her own. Ilara, her mentor, the woman who had sculpted Vespera's mind, who had taught her the precise calculus of control, the sanctity of the great stillness. Ilara's face was a mask of pained disappointment, her silver hair catching the red light like strands of blood. Vespera. The name was not an accusation, but a lament. Look at this chaos, this corruption. This is what you have chosen. Her gaze flickered past Vespera to where Hroldar was fumbling with the conduit's manual release wheel. An alliance with the broken and the base. For what? A ghost in the machine? A phantom memory?
Every word was a carefully calibrated blow designed to reactivate years of conditioning. Vespera could feel the old loyalty stirring, the deeply ingrained belief that order, even a cruel one, was preferable to the entropic madness of raw emotion. The thrumming of the resonance grew louder, and at the edge of her vision the air seemed to shimmer, to warp. Faint whispers slithered beneath the blare of the klaxon, formless and ancient. "The truth, Ilara." Vespera's voice was tight, strained. "We've been lied to." Ilara took a step closer, her expression hardening. "The truth is a scalpel, Vespera. It is not a cudgel for scavengers to wield. The population requires peace, not panic. The stillness must be maintained. You know this. I taught you this. Come back with me. We can rectify this. We can harmonize them, erase this lapse. You can be restored." Restored, wiped clean. The thought sent a jolt of ice through her veins. She saw Aris's face contorted by the vision of his dead wife. She saw Hroldar's raw desperation. This wasn't a lapse. It was an awakening. "No," Vespera said, the word feeling alien on her tongue. Ilara's face fell. The disappointment curdled into something colder, harder. A pity. From her sleeve she produced a neural shock baton, its emitters glowing with contained power. It was the same model Vespera carried, the same one Ilara had first taught her to use. "I will not let you sacrifice this station for a sentimental delusion." Ilara lunged. It wasn't the wild attack of a common guard, but a precise, controlled thrust aimed at the nerve cluster in Vespera's neck. A disabling blow, non-lethal, efficient, just as she had been taught. Instinct, older and deeper than any ideology, flared. Vespera dropped, letting the baton hiss over her head. She pivoted on her heel, coming up inside Ilara's guard. For a split second, they were face to face, so close Vespera could smell the faint ozonic scent of her mentor's clean uniform, a scent from her own past. She saw the shock in Ilara's eyes, the flicker of surprise that her student was no longer playing by the established rules. Vespera didn't hesitate. She grabbed Ilara's wrist with one hand, twisting it back with a sharp, brutal motion she had practiced 1,000 times, a technique Ilara herself had called the unraveling. The baton clattered to the floor. With her other hand, Vespera shoved, not a gentle push, a violent, desperate heave with all her weight behind it. Ilara cried out, stumbling backward. Her body slammed into the server rack behind her. The impact was sickeningly loud. A shower of brilliant white sparks erupted as her weight broke through a corroded panel, her body making contact with the exposed circuitry within. The rack groaned, a deep metallic scream of protest. Data platters shivered in their slots. The crimson lights flickered violently as the system shorted. Ilara slid to the floor, smoke toiling from the scorched fabric of her uniform, her body convulsing slightly. She looked up at Vespera, her eyes wide with a mixture of agony and pure, undiluted betrayal. "Traitor!" The word cut through the wail of the klaxon and the thrum of the resonance. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical force, a brand seared onto Vespera's soul. It echoed in the vast, dying chamber. Traitor. She stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. The sight of her mentor, crumpled and broken amidst the glittering debris of the archive, was a monument to the bridge she had just burned. "Vespera, now!" Hrodar's voice, a lifeline from a world that was still moving. The service hatch was open, revealing a tunnel slick with condensation and glowing faintly with patches of eerie blue-green fungi. The klaxon wailed. The whispers were getting louder, almost forming words. Vespera tore her eyes from Ilara's form. She turned and ran. Her boots echoed on the metal deck, a frantic rhythm against the station's death rattle. She dove through the hatch, Hrodar pulling it shut behind her. The pneumatic door hissed, and the chaotic symphony of the Codex Sepulchre was abruptly cut off, replaced by the damp, humming dark of the service conduit. But she could still hear the word, traitor. It wasn't an echo from the chamber anymore. It was inside her now, a permanent part of her own code. The pained resolve settled in her chest, heavy and cold as a block of salvaged steel. There was no going back. There was only forward, into the darkness. The heavy clang of the maglock engaging behind them was the sound of a tomb being sealed. Eris's lungs burned, each gasp a mix of recycled air and the metallic tang of his own adrenaline. He leaned against the curved, weeping wall of the service conduit, his hand pressed over his chest as if to physically restrain his hammering heart. The space was impossibly tight, a sarcophagus of rusted durasteel and sweating pipes, barely wide enough for 2 people to stand abreast. They were 4. Vespera moved first. Her panic, if she felt any, was sublimated into terrifying efficiency. Without a word, she produced a small, multifaceted tool and jammed it into the manual release port of the access hatch they'd just tumbled through. A series of clicks, a low groan, and the external release was dead. She then pulled a thin, silvery film from her pocket and pressed it over the edges of the hatch, the material shimmering for a moment before becoming one with the rust-pitted metal. A thermal and acoustic cloak. She was prepared for this. For betrayal. The thought sent a chill through Eris, colder than the condensation dripping down his neck. "Stay quiet," she commanded, her voice flat, devoid of the tremor Eris felt in his own bones. Her eyes, pale in the gloom cast by a single flickering maintenance strip overhead, scanned the conduit in both directions.
Hrodar, ever the survivor, had already slumped against the opposite wall, his breath coming in ragged, annoyed bursts. He wiped a smear of grime from his cheek with the back of his hand, his gaze darting from the sealed hatch to the old man crumpled between them. "Well," Hrodar rasped, his voice a low growl that barely disturbed the oppressive silence. "That went smoothly." Eris ignored him. His attention was fixed on Valerius Otho, the exiled architect. The man whose theories had birthed the nightmare of resonance was a wreck. He was propped against the bundle of thick, insulated cables, his fine robe stained with grease and something darker. His face was the color of old parchment, his eyes wide and unfocused. A tremor ran through his entire body, a continuous, violent shudder that seemed to originate from his very soul. He kept touching his temple, his fingers ghosting over the spot where the harmonizer's induction needles had almost made contact. He had seen it too, the face that had manifested in the chamber. Not Lyra, but another. For a horrifying, disorienting moment, the 2 echoes had seemed to overlap in the failing systems, a palimpsest of ghosts. The woman's face had been old, her eyes filled with a sad, knowing look that had been directed squarely at Otho, and Otho had recognized her. Eris pushed himself off the wall, his knees weak. He crouched in front of the shaking man. "Otho? Valerius?" The old man's gaze slowly, sluggishly found his. There was no recognition there, only a profound, bottomless terror. He was echo-lost, Eris thought, not by a machine, but by the raw, brutal truth he'd just witnessed. "His name," Otho mumbled,
his voice a dry crackle. "The lead architect, Vance's second, Kalen. He knew. He was waiting." "We know," Vespera said, her voice cutting through the humid air. She had finished her work and now stood over them, a stark silhouette against the weak light. Her tone was no longer that of a subordinate, but of a commander assessing a compromised unit. "The question is, what now? Valerius, we don't have time for you to shatter. Are you compromised? Did the field touch you?" Otho flinched at her words. He looked from Vespera's clinical expression to Hrondar's cynical scowl, and finally to Aris's desperate face. His breathing hitched. He was a cornered animal, surrounded by predators of a different stripe.
"The field didn't touch me," Otho whispered, his voice gaining a sliver of focus. "But I saw her, Ilara. She was my assistant on the original project. She died 50 years ago, a feedback noop during a primary test." Haraldar let out a short, mirthless puff of air. "So, the ghosts are real. Wonderful. Another complication. Can we move? The station's security drones aren't known for their patience." "We move when we know who we're moving with," Vespera stated, her eyes locked on Otho. "The architects just tried to erase you. They used a resonance event as a weapon against us. They have corrupted your work, your legacy. You can stay here and wait for them to come back and finish the job, or you can come with us, with me, and you can help us find out why." It was a stark choice, a death sentence or a treasonous alliance. Aris held his breath. Everything hinged on this moment. Without Otho's knowledge of Aethelgard's deepest, most secret systems, their quest for the archive was a suicidal fantasy. The old architect's shuddering began to subside. He stared at his own hands, calloused and ink-stained, the hands of a theorist, a dreamer. Aris watched a war being fought behind the man's eyes, the lifetime of belief in the great stillness, in the benevolent warder of the architects, crashing against the brutal reality of their attack. The face of Ilara, plucked from the void and worn like a mask, was the battering ram that had broken down the walls of his conviction. "Perverted it," he said, his voice low and guttural, resonating in the cramped space. "That's the word. Not suppressed, not controlled. Perverted." He pushed himself up, using the cable bundle for support. He was unsteady, but his spine was straight. "My theories, they were about connection, about the persistence of neural patterns as a form of energy, a natural phenomenon to be studied, to be understood. We theorized that a powerful emotional imprint could leave a trace in the station's biosubstrate, an echo, benign, faint."
He gestured vaguely back in the direction of the harmonization chamber. That, what they did in there, was not benign. They didn't just listen to the echo. They amplified it, focused it, turned it into a psychic cudgel. They used Ilara's memory to attack me. A new strength entered his voice, the quavering academic replaced by a wrathful patriarch. They built this station's philosophy on my work, the great stillness, the sanctity of a quiet mind, all of it. And all this time, they have been secretly twisting it into its opposite, a tool for psychological warfare, a weapon. He met each of their gazes in turn. Aris saw his own desperation mirrored there, Vespera's cold resolve, even Haroldar's hard-bitten pragmatism. You want to know why? Otho's lips peeled back in a grimace that was almost a smile. I no longer just want to know why. I want to undo it. They have built their house of lies on the bones of my life's work. They have taken my dream and turned it into a torture device. He stood as tall as he could in the hunched confines of the conduit, his stained robes hanging on him like a judge's vestments. I will help you. I will give you everything I know, every back door, every system schematic, every forgotten protocol from the foundation of this station. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the rhythmic drip of water somewhere down the pipe-choked corridor. The four of them, the disgraced scientist, the cynical scavenger, the traitorous enforcer, and the vengeful creator, stood together in the gut of the machine they meant to destroy. Eris felt a surge, not of hope, but of grim, terrifying possibility. The ghost of Lyra was no longer just a symptom of his grief. She was a key, and this man held the knowledge of the lock she might fit. Good, Vespera said, the single word sealing the pact. Her gaze was already distant, processing new variables. Then we begin. Otho, we need a map of the ossuary's deep archives, the ones that aren't on any official schematic. We need to find the core.
The air in the service conduit was thick with the sins of a century. It smelled of hot dust, burnt ozone, and the faint cloying sweetness of decay that clung to everything on Aethelgard, a miasma that even the most aggressive recyclers couldn't scrub. Eris leaned his head back against a bundle of insulated cabling, the rough plastic biting into his scalp. His bones ached. A deep, resonant weariness had settled into his marrow, but beneath it, a current of triumphant energy hummed, fierce and unfamiliar. He had done it. They were doing it. 20 feet away, crouched around a portable, flickering hollow table, the rest of their impossible alliance whispered strategy. The light from the schematic painted their faces in shifting geometries of blue and gray. Valerius Otho, the exiled architect, gestured with long, elegant fingers, his voice a low, precise murmur that sliced through the conduit's ambient hum. The patrol vectors are predictable, but only if we assume their timings are based on the old custodial guard protocols. The architects are more erratic. Across from him, Hurldar Brecker grunted, his heavy form folded uncomfortably onto a rusted utility crate. Erratic means sloppy, or it means they're setting a trap. He scratched at the grime-caked collar of his rad suit. His presence was an anchor of pure, unrefined cynicism in their sea of desperate hope. Vespera Lyrian said nothing. She merely watched the schematic, her face a mask of disciplined neutrality. But Eris could see the tension in the line of her jaw, the way her fingers were curled so tightly in her lap they must be bloodless. For her, this was not a heist. It was apostasy. Eris closed his eyes, letting their voices wash over him. The low thrum of the station's failing heart vibrated up through the metal floor, a constant, mournful rhythm. He had poured everything into this, his last legitimate echoes, his academic credibility, what little remained of it, and his trust. He had placed his trust in a bitter scavenger, a disgraced heretic, and a woman who until a week ago would have happily overseen his neural harmonization. And it was working. They had a plan. A fragile, insane, beautiful plan. For the first time since Lyra, since the expedition, he felt a sliver of something that wasn't guilt. It was purpose. A conviction so sharp and clear it almost hurt.
He felt a change in the air before he saw it. A subtle pressure shift, a silencing of the dust motes dancing in the single beam of a maintenance light. The tang of ozone sharpened, and the ambient temperature dropped a single noticeable degree. He opened his eyes. She was there. Lyra. Not a memory, not a dream, a resonance. She coalesced out of the gloom, spun from flickering light and the desperate energy of his own fractured psyche. She stood a few feet away, her form translucent, the web of pipes and conduits behind her still faintly visible through the pale glow of her body. She wore the simple off-white jumpsuit she'd favored on the dig site, her dark hair pulled back just as he remembered. Her smile. That was the thing that broke him every time. It was a private, gentle curve of her lips that had always been just for him. He felt the exhaustion melt from his limbs, the ache in his soul replaced by a profound, warming relief. This was his reward, the proof that he was on the right path. "Lyra," he breathed, the name a prayer on his lips. Her voice was not an echo in his mind, but a sound in the air, a perfect reconstruction of her timbre, soft and melodic. "You look tired, Aris." He managed a weak, shaky laugh. "It's been a long few cycles, but you're doing it." Her eyes, the color of warm honey, held his. They shone with a pride that he had been starving for, a validation that no scientific breakthrough could ever provide. "I was so afraid you'd let them silence you, that you'd let them call it a glitch and just give up." "Never," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not when I knew you were here. Not when I knew there was a chance." He trailed off, overwhelmed. He was talking to his dead wife in a dusty service passage, plotting to steal the foundational secrets of their dying world, and it felt more real, more sane than any moment of the past 5 years. She was the signal in the noise, the truth in the lies. "You found the others, the broken ones, the lost ones. You're giving them a purpose too." He nodded, swallowing hard. "They just needed to see, to believe." "You made them believe," she said, her smile widening. "My brilliant, stubborn Aris, always chasing the ghost in the machine."
He was lost in that smile, drowning in the warmth of her praise. It was a balm, a sacrament. The guilt that had been a physical weight on his shoulders for years seemed to dissolve, replaced by the incandescent glow of her approval. This was his redemption. He wasn't just chasing a memory, he was fighting for her. For all of them. He was a scientist again, on the verge of the greatest discovery in human history. And it was in that moment of pure, devotional blindness that the flaw appeared. For a single, imperceptible frame of time, her face glitched. It wasn't a flicker or a fade. It was a catastrophic failure of data integrity. The right side of her beatific smile suddenly stretched, pulling the corner of her lip up towards her ear in a grotesque, inhuman angle. The pixels that formed the smooth skin of her left cheek momentarily lost their cohesion, resolving into a shimmering, tessellated pattern that was less like light and more like the iridescent carapace of some deep-sea insect. Her left eye, the one furthest from him, drifted a fraction of an inch too far towards her temple, breaking the perfect, beloved symmetry of her face. It was a subtle shift, a blink and you miss it tear in the fabric of the projection, a horrifying alien geometry superimposed over the face of the woman he loved. The expression it created was not one of pride or love. It was something else entirely. Something hungry. It lasted less than a heartbeat. Then it was gone. The pixels snapped back into place. The smile was just a smile again. The skin was smooth. The eyes were perfectly aligned, warm and full of love. The echo of Lyra stood before him, flawless and beautiful, her expression unchanged. Eris saw none of it. His focus was internal, basking in the absolution her presence granted him. He was looking at her, but he was seeing the memory, not the manifestation. His mind, so desperate for the comfort she offered, automatically filtered out the anomaly, discarding the terrifying data as nothing more than a stray thought, a flicker of his own neural fatigue. "Be careful, Eris," she whispered, her voice a soft caress. She raised a translucent hand, and for a moment he thought she would touch his cheek. The air before his face grew cold. The architects of silence are not the only ones who value stillness. Her form began to thin, the light that composed her dimming, bleeding back into the oppressive gloom of the conduit.
"Wait," he pleaded, reaching out. "Lyra, don't go!" His hand passed through empty air, the last of her light dissolving like smoke. She was gone. The warmth lingered for a moment, then faded, leaving behind the familiar chill of the station. The scent of ozone and dust rushed back in to fill the void. The murmuring from the holotable grew louder in the sudden silence. "And that's when we overload the tertiary power grid," Otho was saying. "It will create a 5-minute blind spot in their internal sensor network. No more, no less." Aris took a slow, steadying breath. He felt renewed. The doubt that had been a constant gnawing pest in the back of his mind was gone, replaced by a crystalline certainty. He turned away from the empty space where she had stood, a small, genuine smile touching his own lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. He was not Echo lost. He was a savior. He walked back toward the others, his step lighter, his resolve hardened into something unbreakable. He didn't notice the patch of bioluminescent fungi on the pipe beside him flicker and die, its ethereal glow extinguished by the lingering cold.